Today, the topic that I'm going to discuss is about the current starvation situation in Gaza, in which the starvation has been adopted as a tool for the genocide and for the mass migration to push the Palestinians out of Gaza. So, for this, I have joined by Dr. Alex Diwal. He is executive director of the World Peace Foundation, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining me.
It's good to be with you.
So, first of all, you have written a lot of publication on the starvation, and you are a very keen observer of the starvation, especially in South Africa and other region. So, how you see currently the starvation as a tool that is adopted by the Israeli government towards the Palestinian in Gaza?
So I've been studying this topic of famine, humanitarian action, and starvation for just over 40 years. So I began my career as a humanitarian worker and as a researcher in the Horn of Africa. And for most of the years that I was working on this, I was very optimistic that famine was a problem that would be solved within my lifetime. What we saw was fewer food crises, fewer famines, and less lethal famines. And those that remained, those crises that remained, were entirely those that were brought about by war. So if you look at all the famines of the last 30 years or so, whether it's in Yemen, Syria, or Sudan, or Ethiopia, or Somalia, or Nigeria, or Congo, or wherever, it is always because either as the outcome of war, or deliberately as a weapon of war, a belligerent has been using starvation. And this was a problem that could be solved. It could be solved by international law, by international norms, by better humanitarian practices, such that when I wrote a book 10 years ago called Mass Starvation, the History and Future of Famine, and I began that book by saying, this is a book about a success. This is a problem we are on the way to solving. Unfortunately, I was wrong. What we've seen in the last 10 years is a regression. And the regression has been in many of those countries I mentioned. But the most notable and striking regression has been Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza against the Palestinians, where you had a population that was, prior to the war in October, relatively well fed, relatively healthy, had it was a lower middle income society. It was food insecure only in one respect, and that one respect was that it depended on Israel that controlled its borders and controlled its supplies. But nobody needed to go hungry in Gaza. What we've seen during this war that began in the immediate aftermath in response to Hamas's attacks, brutalities, atrocities on October 7th, is the use of starvation as a weapon of war in a manner that is more systematic and directed and frankly more brutal than really any in the last generation.
So, when it comes to the collective punishment, and we saw that Israel already facing like international criminal court, the genocidal case of this collective punishment. So, how you see that when it's come to starvation, how lethal, how brutal it is that a collective population and you see the difference between this and the other observation that you have observed this kind of the starvations.
So what we see is several things happening, and they're slightly separate both in the practice of war and in under law. But let me go through the three main elements. The first is the war crime of starvation, the primary element of the war crime of starvation as defined in international criminal law, also in international humanitarian law, is the destruction of objects indispensable to survival. So that obviously includes food, but it also includes water, health services, sanitation, anything that is needed for people to survive. And what we've seen in Gaza is a massive campaign of that. And the justification that Israel gives for this is that it is targeting Hamas infrastructure. Now, there is Hamas there, definitely, and Hamas is a legitimate military target. But the restrictions on starvation make it in international law make it very clear that you cannot starve a civilian population even when there are armed elements within it. And there's a very simple rationale for this. I mean, there's a lot of legality I could go into, but the rationale for this is, let us say you have a population of 1 million people, and it's 90% civilian and 10% military. We all know that the last people to starve are the men with guns. So you will need to starve the civilian 90% before you starve those men with guns. And that is the basic rationale for it being outlawed. The second element of the crime is the obstruction of humanitarian relief. And here, what Israel has done is it only allowed in a minimum of relief at best in order for the population not to get plunged into full-scale famine. But in the last few months, that strategy has changed. So it has, beginning in March, it imposed a total blockade, and it was always obstructing UN assistance. Now it has made that obstruction much more systematic, much larger scale, and it has brought in its own new system, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that is not providing enough. It is not providing just not enough food. It's not providing the right food. It's not providing the types of specialized assistance that will keep malnourished children alive. And it is it's doing it in a way that is extremely dangerous and inhumane. You know, more than 800 Palestinians have been killed at it trying to get aid from it. And so that is also a violation. And then there's the other element, which is slightly different. So the International Criminal Court, which is responsible for individual accountability, has brought charges against the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. And if they are arrested and brought to court, they will be brought to court in an individual capacity for war crimes or crimes against humanity. And obviously, this is very controversial. Separately, South Africa brought a case to the International Court of Justice, which is an arm of the United Nations, for interstate disputes. And it brought a charge of genocide. And it said that Israel was committing genocide. This was its argument. Now, the court will take many years before it resolves this case. It will probably be another 2-3 years. But what the court did in January of last year, 2024, was that it ruled that the Palestinians of Gaza were plausibly in danger of being subject to genocidal conditions of life, being destroyed as a people. And it therefore gave 3 orders, one in January, one in March, one in May. And in doing so, it activated a duty to prevent genocide. And that duty falls both on Israel and on other states that are party to the Genocide Convention. So even without actually finding Israel responsible for genocide, there is a duty to prevent the kinds of mass starvation, destructive conditions of life that are unfolding.
So, when it comes to the international law, we have seen that Israel always has eroded the international law. And when this matter comes to the United Nations, then we see that only one hand that raised for the veto, and that is the United States. So, how you see that in this mass starvation and this international humanitarian crisis and this genocidal punishment, how you see the U.S. role in the capacity of protecting the international law?
So You're right. There's been a very special relationship between the United States and Israel, and the US has consistently shielded Israel from any action at the UN General Assembly, UN Security Council, and is very adamantly opposed to Israel being brought to the International Court of Justice. Though it can't stop that, it cannot actually stop that. It cannot withdraw from the International Court of Justice without withdrawing from the United Nations itself. It's one of those integral organs. Nor indeed can Israel. They just try and reject it. The core issue I think that we're facing now is that this is an issue that is a moral issue that transcends law. So, and under the first Trump administration in 2018, a resolution was brought to the UN Security Council on the issue of armed conflict and hunger in order to pull together all the strands of law and basically to put in place a mechanism at the UN for responding when armed conflict threatened famine. And the then Trump permanent representative at the UN, Nikki Haley, she voted in favor of this. This was a unanimous motion. And what that did was that it reflected a moral consensus across the board in the United States, in China, in Russia, in Africa, that starvation of civilians is just plain wrong. And even though there was some double standards, like the US would call out the starvation imposed by the Syrian regime and not the one imposed by its friends in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates on Yemen, it would nonetheless try and mitigate that. It would nonetheless take action whenever there was some government-sponsored starvation to try and minimize it or stop it. I think what we're seeing now is something much more dangerous, which is that this norm itself is being torn up, and it's not clear whether this is going to succeed or not. There's a lot of public concern in the United States and in Israel, around the world, that it is simply wrong to starve people in this way. But if Israel is allowed to do it, not only is that very wrong in itself, but it also opens the door to many others practicing starvation, even as a war crime, as a crime of genocide around the world.
So at this hour, that the imagery that is coming from the Gaza is horrific, and we see the skeleton of the children, and even beyond this. Some images and some videos are really that it's eye opener, and even that you cannot bear even to see these videos. So under the existing circumstances, what precedent Israel is going to set for the future scenarios, that if such kind of the conflicts or wars happened, so what is the precedent that Israel is going to set through this mass starvation?
I think it's a terrible precedent. Let me look at the argument that Israel is making in order to defend itself. And each of the arguments falls away. So the first argument is there is no starvation in Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu and others have said this. And of course, they are not allowing international journalists in there. They're not permitting the United Nations food systems and agencies that have monitors in to really measure this. So the challenge to that is, okay, let's go and see. But the data we have and the pictures we have make it very clear that it is what he's saying is not true. There is starvation in Gaza. He then blames Hamas. Now, Hamas is guilty of many crimes, but the crime of mass starvation of its own people, it is not guilty of that one. And the United States investigated incidents, 156 incidents of looting, and it found that Hamas was not systematically looting. I'm sure that individual Hamas members may have been eating that food, but it was not systematically doing that. And the New York Times followed up, talking to Israeli senior officers, and confirmed, yes, that was the case. So what Israel has trying to do now is to put in place an alternative system to the UN. The UN system that was a system that was actually bringing food according to humanitarian principles, food and other essentials, to people where they were in a dignified way. And the new system, this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, plus some airdrops, is a system that does not provide sufficient assistance. The amounts are not enough. Does not provide good enough rations. The rations are imbalanced. Does not provide the essentials for starving children who need hospital care. And it's done in a way that is very, very dangerous. People have to go, risk their lives to get to this food. And there's no monitoring and follow-up. So we don't actually know who is eating the food. In fact, ironically, the GHF system is much more likely to deliver substantial food to the hands of Hamas and armed gangs as well. So it doesn't meet the criterion of humanity. The very first principle of humanitarianism, according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, according to the United Nations, is the principle of humanity. And running an operation in this way is so profoundly degrading, humiliating, dehumanizing, that it cannot be seen as humanitarian. So we are actually at a moment in which the very notion of what it is to be humanitarian is being dismantled. And I think that is very, very dangerous.
So my final question is this, that at this moment, what the international players and those powers that has some say to stop this mass starvation, what could be the immediate relief to stop this starvation and this famine in the Gaza? What you would like to comment?
So what makes this particular situation so unique from an aid operational point of view is that it can be turned around overnight. This is a famine with an off switch. If Israel were to allow the United Nations system to operate as it has the resources, it has the skills, the capacities, the plans, everything. If it were allowed to do that, this famine could be halted. It is simply a question of political decision in Israel, and what the technicalities are not complex. It is the politics of getting the Israeli Prime Minister to make that decision. That is the challenge.
Thank you very much, Alex de Waal, who is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation and the author of the book Mass Starvation. Thank you very much for your time and for your insight.
Thank you very much.